to talk about a debut thriller by Australian author Lisa Medved. Lisa Medved is living since 2008, I believe, in the Netherlands, and she has written a thriller with a dual timeline. The most important part is set in the 17th century, early 17th century, and it talks about the feud that really existed between our most famous painter, or one of our most famous painters, Pieter Paul Rubens, and his engraver Lucas Forsterman. That is a feud that is really very well documented. It really happened, so that is based on a true story. Now, you have to know that Pieter Paul Rubens was not only an artist, he was also a diplomat, and most of all, he was an entrepreneur, and a very good one. And he knew how to make money, and he knew how to market himself. So he used for that his engravings, and it was really important that his engravings reflected his work, like it should. So he hired Lucas Forsterman to engrave his drawings. But Lucas Forsterman was also a very talented engraver and a drawer. And more, Lucas Forsterman gave his own twist to the drawings. So they weren't exact copies anymore. And even worse, he started to sign the engravings with his name. And that infuriated Pieter Paul Rubens, because he said, well, first of all, I pay you to copy my work, to put it on those copper plates so it can be printed and distributed. And you change them a little bit, and then you put your own name under it. And that's unheard of. That's stealing, actually, in a way, which is true when you ask me. If you are, you can be as good as you want, but if somebody asks you to copy something and you know that it is really important to do it very precisely because it's a way of promoting your art, and you can't start changing the drawings and the ideas and put your own name under it. That's unheard of. If you want to make a name for yourself, then make your own drawings and invent your own ideas and come up with your own ideas. So, of course, there's a huge feud, and they separate. That part of the story is told by Antonia. Antonia was the daughter of Lucas Forsterman. And Antonia was often asked to join Lucas Forsterman to the house of Pieter Paul Rubens, and she was friends with the daughter Clara of Pieter Paul Rubens. And she really could notice that things were going wrong between her father and Clara's father. At a certain point, the feud between the two erupts, and Lucas Forsterman does something that is unheard of. And he confides in his daughter, and he tells what he has done. That's the first part of the timeline. The second timeline is told by, I believe it's Charlotte. Don't quote me on this, I'm very bad with names. And Charlotte is a Canadian scholar, and she has a passion for Rubens. And she comes to the Antwerp University to study and to lecture about Rubens. Now, at the same time, she also deals with the loss of her mother, who is also very important to her, because her mother was she raised Charlotte on her own, and she doesn't know who the father is. And by chance, she, when she's at the University of Antwerp. They receive a box from a beguinage that with all kinds of papers, and in that box is also a small atlas, an atlas from the 17th century, dated just after Peter Paul, his death. But they quickly notice that there's something wrong with that atlas. They see that it is dedicated to Rubens, or that it belonged to Rubens, or it had something to do with Rubens. And they also find some odd things. They quickly realize that some letters are in a different, slightly different color. A lot of odd things about it. And they start analyzing that book, and then they discover things that talk about the feud between Rubens and Lucas Forsterman. Actually, the atlas belonged to Antonia. So yeah, that's the story. So that's the arc, the main introduction. It's an easy read, it's a quick read. They say that it's as good as the miniaturists and the girl with the pearl earring. That's a bit of a stretch, but it's not bad. It's a good read, it's a fun read. The picture you see is in Dutch because the book is published in Dutch first, and that happens a lot. A lot of English and American books first come out in Dutch and then only in their original language. That's normal. Like Young Mungo, for instance, we could read Mungo a week before in Dutch. Same with Elizabeth Finch by Julian Barth. It happens a lot. And also probably because she lives in the Netherlands, so she probably first got the translation, and then afterwards, later this year, the English, the Engraver, will be published. So yeah, easy read, thriller aspect is okay-ish, but I had issues, and I had serious issues, because this 16th, 17th century is something that I've read a lot about, and I've written a lot about it too. But I've read a lot about it, and I know a lot about it, and I know I've studied the culture and the daily life of the 17th century as a hobby, and also partly as my education. And there were quite a few mistakes, and that bothered me. Well, the first most blunt mistake that she made is a part of the story is set in a beguinage in modern times, and that is impossible. You know, the last beguine that lived in Antwerp died of a very old age in, was it early 80s? So that's 40 years ago. So if you want to have your current timeline be a little bit more accurate, don't use a beguine, because they're dead. There are no more beguines, real beguines, I mean. There are people that call themselves beguines, but not in Belgium anymore. That doesn't exist. A beguinage is also, a beguine is different as a nun. There are still nuns in Belgium, not many, but there are still nuns, and especially younger nuns. A beguine is different as a nun. A nun is married to God, for instance, and a nun lives in a monastery, and a nun has no assets, has no personal possessions. Actually, she is the possession of the convent, actually, of God. She can't even decide what to do each day. She has to follow her orders. She has to do the tasks that she is supposed to do. She can't choose her life. There's no choice in her life. That's why also they wear a wedding ring, because they are married to God. A Begin is different. A Begin came later. A Begin is also a religious person, but she is her own woman. So they live in a beguinage, but a beguinage is not like a convent. It's not one big building. They're all separate houses. You can own your own house. You can rent one or you can own one. You can build your own house within the beguinage. That is all possible. You can be rich as a begin. That's also possible. You don't have to give your belongings to the beguinage. You decide what you do. You can have your own way of making money. If you want to be a seamstress, you can. If you want to be a nurse, you can. You choose. That's the biggest difference. Actually, it was a way of for women to be more independent without having to marry a guy. You know, in the 16th, 17th century, and even later on, you were, in a way, a woman had two choices: either get married or go in a convent. That was it. And the beguinage was a certain way of go around it. Why am I telling all this? Well, some parts in the book don't work, because the Begin that committed suicide from the Belfry at the age of 40, well, that's impossible. It's impossible. Or she must have set the current timeline in the 50s, for instance. But she didn't, so it bothered me. It really bothered me. And she jumped from the Belfry. There is no Belfry in Antwerp. There's a beguinage in Antwerp, a beautiful one. But there's no belfry. There's a bell tower, but not a belfry. Maybe it's a bad translation, but you know, a belfry is not even a religious building. It's a building that is owned by the city. It's their vault. It's the most safe place. It's where they keep their money, their books, books as in accountant books, not the books we like. And so it's very unlikely that beguinage is attached to a belfry and you could enter the belfry via the beguinage. That's also something that is impossible. I know it's details, but it throws you off after a while, because there are other things. Like at a certain point, the family of Vostermans moves to England. And Antonia has a discussion with a woman where she says, they talk about cheeses. And I don't know why they do that. She said, I really miss Passendaler cheese. But I really like Stilton too. Now, Passendaler cheese exists since 1970-ish. I know that because it used to be a client of mine, or I worked via different ad agency for Passendaler. There was no previous one. It wasn't set. There was no historical known cheese that was known as Passendaler. And Stilton was dated later, so that didn't exist either. That was more towards the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, Stilton. I know those things, and then it starts to, I trip over them. It's rarely that I trip over those kind of details, because they are details. Well, except for the beguinage, I really... You know, it's weird. I can read a book about spaceships and encounters with aliens and really believe it and really get immersed by the experience without doubting anything. I can read a book, a mystery book, where a wall opens and within that wall there's a whole other universe. I can really believe it. But the Beguines, they did it for me. No. You know, if you want something to work, you could turn your... You can give another twist to your story. If you want somebody to be the last survivor of a certain family, send them to nursing home and somebody is after that last bit of a possession that woman has. You know, it's not difficult to find your way around it, but don't come up with things that are impossible. I'm sorry. So yeah, The Engraver, all in all, an interesting book. If you like medieval, well, not medieval, if you like thrillers that are set in now with a dual timeline now and in the 17th century, it is interesting if you want to know more about engravers and stuff. It really is. But I knew a bit too much to thoroughly enjoy the book in the way that it's supposed to. And I gave it 3 stars. So yeah, The Engraver by Lisa Medved. It will come out later this year in English. Bye bye.